Welcome to the Todd DeVoe Show, exploring the best ideas and lessons for leaders.
Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are at in this fine world. You know, one of the things that we do in emergency management, or when a large-scale disaster or event occurs, is we look for some outside independent help when it comes to writing after-action reports, especially when it's something that involves multi-agencies, events. And so, well, if you've seen what's going on here in the United States in the last few months, you can tell there's been a lot of high-profile events going on. And we're going to talk a little bit about those events. But also, what is the role of the consultant coming in to help write the after-action report? And today, I have with me Nick Lowe, who he wrote the after-action report for a terrorist event that occurred here in California, and then we started talking about that, what it means. And I thought it would be a great idea to get Nick to come in to talk about that process, understand the consultant's role and what they do for us. So Nick, welcome to the show.
Hey, Todd. Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to our discussion this morning, and particularly this particular angle with after-action reports and what consultants can bring in terms of third party. And this has become kind of a niche for my company, CPARS, over the last about 5 years, starting with the after-action report that you were mentioning, the 12/2/15 terrorist attack in San Bernardino County. We've gone on to write a variety of others, including about half a dozen just in the last year and a half to 2 years for jurisdictions' response to COVID-19. So that's been a fascinating experience as well. And that includes the city of Los Angeles' response to COVID-19. We happen to be Southern California and LA based, so a lot of our business is here, but LA County EMS Agency, the Port of Long Beach, a variety of others. So it's been a really fascinating process to establish the business model for after-action reports. It really puts an interesting burden on consulting companies as well as the client themselves. And I know we'll go into a variety of those things, but happy to be here today. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, Nick. So everybody, I'm kind of getting over a cold, so I apologize for coughing. Quick question for you. This is going to sound like a silly question, but what is an after-action report? What's the purpose of it?
Well, really, the root purpose of an after-action report is hopefully to learn from your experience. The first thing I tell clients when we meet with them is the after-action report is not intended to be a gotcha. It's not intended to make anyone look bad, but it is intended to identify gaps in the system, whether that's capabilities in terms of planning, training, exercising, equipment that was used, maybe procedures. Almost always, of course, we find communications as a challenge, but it's not intended to be personal. And that's the biggest thing I communicate to each client is they really need to be open-minded. They really need to want to learn from the experience and not just want to check the box, right? Here in California, for example, when you activate an emergency operations center, the state of California requires you to then write an after-action report. Truth be told, most of those after-action reports just become check the box, right? The state requires it. We've got to do it. Let's just get it submitted. We really look for clients that really want to learn from their experience. So that's the purpose, the primary purpose of the after-action report. The other purpose is to memorialize what happened and when it happened. So you do have the learning element, but also the historical element. So as much as possible, based on actual evidence or recollections, we try to capture data that then presents the story of what happened. So frankly, you as the reader can come to your own judgments about what went particularly well and what are the areas for improvement. And we do try to focus as much as possible evenly on strengths as well as areas for improvement, because we don't want to underestimate the strengths. We don't want to demoralize, the people who were involved who did really great things. We want to champion those efforts. We want them to come back to future responses with the same zest that they came to whatever response we're evaluating. And we also want to optimize those strengths. So maybe we can take those strengths and make them best practices and apply them to either other clients or other jurisdictions or other organizations. So that, I suppose, in a nutshell, is the purpose of the after action report. But it really comes back to the client's driving motivation for doing the after action report in the first place. And hopefully it's with those things in mind and not just to check a box or to come out of it thinking they're just going to look brilliant and everything's going to be glowing, right? So they need to be open to recommendations and areas for improvement as well.
For me, growing up from a kid being an EMT, the paramedic, and then working through the system, we always reviewed our calls, right? We did call reviews, whether it was a independently between the group, or there are case studies that we have to do on calls, and we have to do things called tape reviews and things like this. So we're constantly always taking a look at this and seeing how we can improve ourselves, and that's realistically what we should be doing with the after action reports as well. But that being said, there seems to be, like everything that we do nowadays, politics gets played into it. And I remember writing the after action report for a fire drill that we did, and one of the complaints that came across from the participants in the fire drill saying, "Hey, I didn't even understand what that noise was. I didn't realize it was a fire alarm." I've told the story before. They said it sounded like a dryer buzzer going off. And so I put that in the after action report, and I was told by somebody to remove it because if it was in the after action report, they had to fix it. And I'm like, well, yes, absolutely.
100%. Right? And that's your motivation for writing the report in the first place.
Right. So how do we get people to look at that and saying, yes, this is an improvement plan?
Yeah. So that is a huge challenge, and we run into it. One, I think the first thing is to set expectations up front. So I will honestly say to a client, as soon as we start the project, that one, they will not have editorial control over the report. They never get an editable version of the report, no matter how much they beg or plead for it. We always maintain editorial control of the report. That doesn't mean that they don't get to offer feedback and provide additional evidence if maybe there's something that we missed. But our intention is to look at the response holistically and provide you with a complete picture of the response, good and bad, to tell the whole story regardless of what that covers. It is then up to the client to decide whether they want to change our recommendations into corrective actions and include them in an improvement plan, right? So we argue, at least up front, that we are not changing our recommendations, but the client can choose what they do with those recommendations, and they're not bound to do anything with our recommendations. And so we do always provide an improvement plan, and we explain in the improvement plan that that's their opportunity to even say they disagree with our findings in the after action report, or something we think should be a priority maybe isn't really a priority to them. But I am really a stickler in after action reports. I say up front, do not hire CPARs if you're looking for a whitewashed after action report or you don't want to tell the whole story, because our motivation for even pursuing this work is to save lives and property and to make our communities more resilient. Luckily, as a small business, I have the luxury as the decision maker, and luckily we're successful enough that I can say that, and I can say no to clients. There are certainly consultants out there, I think, unfortunately, but I understand the bind that they're in, who, will say, sure, we'll remove that because it's politically controversial, or it's too much of an ask for the jurisdiction to pursue this remedy. But as for us, we feel that fiduciary obligation to the community to help tell the whole story. And yes, politics is huge. And frankly, we'd all be better off if we just acknowledge that politics does play a role. So, for example, when we did the after action report, I won't name anyone, but for a number of jurisdictions in response to COVID-19, we always ask the question, how did politics play a role? We know everything is about power and jockeying for power and political clout and looking good in front of the public. How did these things play out? And we had some jurisdictions that frankly blatantly lied to us and said, oh, politics had nothing to do with it. We always just had the best interests of the jurisdiction in mind. Frankly, we called them on their BS right then. And of course, after interviewing hundreds of people and surveying their partners and interviewing external stakeholders, we end up finding out the truth anyway. So it's best if we just acknowledge it. And it's funny because I started my career 20 years ago working on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress. So I come to everything. My degree was in political science. So I kind of take a political slant or perspective on many of the things that we do. So I encourage everyone, just acknowledge. We all know it happens. Don't deny it. Let's learn about how to deal with politics in an emergency. Let's use these after action reports as an opportunity to do that and to improve, because it's not going away. We would be ignorant if we thought politics wasn't going to play a role. So it's tough, but it really requires that upfront discussion with the client. And I think, I mentioned to you before, we say upfront to the client that there are things ultimately you're going to read in the report that you don't like or you don't agree with. And we have to agree now to disagree later and to accept that. And that is all part of the process. And hopefully everyone respects the process, realizes that it's independent and autonomous, and things come out cordially in the end. But we've had circumstances where they did not. But sorry, that's a long answer to your question. But yeah, it plays a major role, and it's a constant back and forth, not only with the client themselves, but with all of the stakeholders involved. But I encourage consultants to stand their ground. My integrity is more important to me than any client or any project. And so I would rather lose a client and never work for a client ever again than have anyone in this business take question CPARS's or my personal integrity.
Right.
And so I encourage clients to take that same perspective.
So with that in mind, we were talking earlier about, the last few shooting incidents. So the Buffalo, and then Texas, and then this current one in Illinois.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, we're gonna see these after action reports come out on that, and I mean, Illinois is still fresh. They're still trying to figure what's going on. They don't even the criminal investigation isn't even over on that one.
Right.
But now let's go to Texas here for a minute, and things are leaking from that investigation. It is not looking good for Texas law enforcement right now. What's going to be the process for writing an after action report on something like that?
Yeah. So, the way I think about it from a consultant's perspective is it's almost like serving on a jury. And you do have to come into the process as unbiased as possible, right? When you're going through voir dire for a jury, they ask you, have you heard anything in the news about this case? Do you have any background information on this case? Obviously, every consulting company is going to have some background information on the Uvalde shooting. They're going to have to do their best to put that aside, because even though things are looking, say, bad for law enforcement right now, we don't have the complete picture. And we really try our best to come in and be independent and not come with any preconceived notions. It may very well be that the information coming out right now proves to be the accurate story, and the evaluation of the response is very in line with the information we're hearing. But it's also possible that there are many perspectives that we haven't heard. By the way, speaking of politics, it may be really politically controversial to even say that statement, right? Particularly when you're speaking in front of victims and for survivors, right? And rightfully so, they want to place blame. They're angry,
Yeah.
obviously devastated. And so it is hard for a consultant to go into it and even in this case, maybe tell victims and survivors, listen, we cannot rush to judgment. We have a process in place, but we assure you, if you will, justice will be done through this process. We will do an independent analysis. But that's one of the struggles we ran into in San Bernardino, for example. And it was really one of the hardest evaluations of my career was, speaking directly with and interviewing the victims and the survivors who rightfully so wanted to place blame on us as consultants doing the evaluation. And by the way, there's nothing you can say or do to defend yourself, really, nor should you,
No.
when someone has lost a loved one, other than hear them out and hear their concerns. But it may be that they too don't find things in your evaluation that they agree with, and they may heavily disagree. And you, as the consultant, have to have thick enough skin to deal with that. But I think when it comes to something like Uvalde, where a lot of information is coming out already, you have to go into it independently. You have to put aside everything you've heard. You have to start from the beginning, gather all of the evidence, gather the reports, do all the interviews, do all the surveying, whatever it may be, and try to come into it as independently as possible. And then when you produce the report, produce something that's as truthful as possible. And I say that because, many of these evaluations are based on people's recollections of what happened. In many cases, there isn't direct evidence, there isn't video recordings or radio recordings of communications. So it's tough to take, all of these perspectives and try to figure out what the facts are and what the true story is from those different perspectives. And in some cases, it's okay, in my opinion, at least as an author of these after action reports, to present multiple perspectives and say, well, we don't know if story A or story B is accurate based on recollection, but we can learn from both of those stories. And so what can be learned from those two perspectives? And I think it's okay as a consultant to acknowledge that. I'm not threatened by saying, hey, we couldn't get to the root cause of this issue. There just wasn't enough evidence. But here's what we can learn from at least what we heard and those perspectives that we learned about. And again, all of this just means the consultant has to be confident, has to stand their ground, has to be capable enough to make those types of statements. By the way, the only other thing I was going to mention on the after action report is, you were mentioning when you were in EMS and doing, kind of after action reviews. I always tell everyone, your after action report doesn't need to be 100 pages long or 200 pages long. Probably if you hire a consultant and it's a major incident,
Right.
it probably will be that long. I just tell anyone, I know everyone's busy. We continue responses on a daily basis. Even take 15 minutes to sit down and jot down some lessons learned from those responses. Make a bulletized list. Maybe it's half a page, maybe it's page long. That's fine, but at least learn something from each experience. But you don't always have to write, a 100-page report, which is why many jurisdictions don't. But I encourage everyone just to do something after each response.
Absolutely. It has to be as big as it needs to be, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Excuse me. So a couple things on that. One is I'm going to bring Mark Baker in, our book editor. He's reviewing a book on disaster by design, and I think this might actually fall into this conversation a bit. Mark, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. So, you're listening to the conversation. In the book Disaster by Design, does that fall into what we're talking about as far as like the after action and what it means to improve from from disaster response?
So I think so. I think it definitely falls into the after action review process and identifying the vulnerabilities that were created by our choices. Just to back up a little bit on the AAR topic that Nick was having, I think that's personally. I just wanted to chime in and say that I feel that that's the most important process in growth is that after action review process. But it only works if all the players involved come in with they come in humble and willing to be vulnerable, and they set emotions aside, and then you have a totally productive after action review process, and from that you identify your gaps and improvement plans. I think that's how you grow, especially in this profession, and it carried over for me from the Army as well. And so I just wanted to throw that out there before pivoting. Natural Disaster or Disaster by Choice is the book.
What is this by choice? I'm sorry.
Disaster by Choice by Ian Kellman. And it goes into the choices we make as humans as far as creating vulnerability, where we choose to build our structures and live in regards to the hazards that it's vulnerable to, and what we choose to build it out of, and whether or not we choose to implement recommended mitigations that would be identified during an after action review process. And if we choose to do those things, we improve our position and reduce our vulnerability to disaster. And if we don't, we create bad situations for ourselves. We depend on others to come and help us and stress the disaster response capability of the local community by making those choices or not making those choices. I thought an important thing from that one was the other side of the coin was when you have the choice, you don't make a choice or you make a bad choice, et cetera, is one thing. But what about that? What about that segment of the population that does not have that choice? They don't have the money to implement those mitigations. They don't have the resources, and they're not getting the attention they deserve from the local community, the leaders within that community to help that. So those are the folks that kind of stuck out there, and for me, it sparked an idea to go forward to really hone in and focus on that locally. But yeah, so that disaster by choice, it's about natural hazards are one thing, but they only become disasters when they impact, right? So if nobody lived on the southeastern coastline, we'd never the impact of a hurricane would be significantly decreased, right? But that's not realistic. That's not probable. So you have to understand the vulnerability, make good choices to mitigate as much as possible, and then and you got to. When you're told to evacuate, you got to heed those warnings too. You got to have a plan. You can't stick our heads into the sand anymore and hope for the best. We have to have a plan. In the Army they used to say, hope is not a plan, and I believe that's pretty accurate for this situation too.
So Nick, when you take a look at this, I mean, I know we're talking a lot about violence, right? But on the other end of it, I mean, we still do after action reports for like the large scale fires in California, super hurricanes, all the hurricanes actually, but the things that make the news at least. What's the difference in the view that you take, or maybe there's not, the view that you take a look at when you're looking at those natural disasters compared to a man-made crisis?
Yeah, truthfully, I don't really take a different approach. Our process remains the same. Our independence, our autonomy remains the same. We're still looking to identify strengths and potential gaps in the response and identify recommendations and potentially corrective actions. The only thing I would say changes is maybe some of the terminology and the wording and the sensitivities you take to let's call it a violent or man-made incident versus a natural disaster. Obviously, we all know that the hurricane or the earthquake, wasn't intentionally targeting a family or an individual or a community. However, the terrorist or the perpetrator may very likely be targeting a certain individual. So we do change maybe the language that we're using. We often don't even refer to the name of the perpetrator or the terrorist in our reports. We'd much rather give attention to the survivors and the victims than the perpetrator themselves. We're not here to promote the perpetrator's activity or to make a celebrity of the perpetrator. We'll often talk to the families first about what kind of language they want us to use. Do they want us to say that their family was taken versus their family being lost in an emergency. And so that's probably the big difference just in terms of the terminology of the report. But it's funny, just listening to Mark, one of the things we have found in after action reports related to natural disasters that I think directly relates to the book Mark was speaking about is, we are a politically correct society, and political correctness also affects emergency response and our expectations on the community to respond. One of the reasons our society is less prepared than, say, Japan is because it's not politically correct in the United States for us to say, listen, if you don't have 14 days of supplies and food and water, you might die. We don't say that because it's not politically correct. They say that in Japan, and people are significantly more prepared than we are here in the United States, right? So those things play a role. Likewise, even with urban development, if you look at the Christchurch earthquake of, forgive me, the years fleeting, maybe 2014, right? Christchurch came back and said, because of the devastation we experienced, we are not going to rebuild in a certain area of the city, period. It's
Right.
now just open land, right? In the United States, it's not politically correct to say that, right? Everyone has the right to rebuild on their property, right? So we have continuously occurring incidents in the same areas and the same nature because it's not politically correct here. So, a little bit of my personal opinion there, but it is a finding we have found in these after action reports. And since Todd, you brought up politics before and how politics plays a role in these things too, and political correctness there. I think we need to be much more forthcoming with the public about the real consequences of these emergencies. Just like we were just talking before we got on the air about active shooter incidents and the run, hide, fight. We don't teach people that this is a fight to the death, right? It's either you or the perpetrator. There's no talking the perpetrator down. You must fight this person to the death, right? Stab them in the neck, whatever it takes, blind them, right? These things have to happen, but we don't teach that because, we're kind of a gentler society, perhaps. We're not
We teach throw tennis balls at them.
Right, exactly, or talk them down or whatever. But we focus on the run and hide part, but not the fight part and what that really means. So, I think we need to start talking to Americans like they're adults, like they have some personal responsibility. And I think until that changes, we're going to continue to see a lack of preparedness in the public in this country. So sorry, my personal thoughts on that topic.
Yeah, you can get me started, and we'll go down that rabbit hole of the violence of action and what that means. And Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, so I totally agree with what you're saying, Nick. I think that a hard reality-based discussion is necessary for our current climate. But the reality is that our current generation, if you will, is not prepared to accept that. They're not prepared. They're not emotionally in the right place to have that hard conversation. So I find myself, as an emergency manager, trying to have that conversation with, the school officials. How do you, maybe you have a technique is what I'm trying to get at. How do you convey the seriousness of that situation and the reality of the threat to a politically correct, emotionally sensitive audience? So have you had any techniques that's worked for that from your point?
Yeah, I think recommendations we've made. One, a lot of it comes from peers, right? So we live in a society now of influencers, right? So who are the Instagram influencers and the Twitter influencers, things like that. Now I'm sounding aged too. Now my gray hair is starting to stand out.
You just got to let it hang out, Nick.
Right? But you have to communicate to that generation. You have to communicate with them through the avenues that they listen to. So in this case, I do think you do have to partner with influencers and those types of individuals to communicate with that generation. Likewise, for maybe an older generation, you do have to use more frank communications and continue those. But you have to at least use those frank communications. And in many cases, we're not using any of those blunt messaging in either case, regardless of who you're communicating to. So I do think there's a piece, and there's also a piece about getting the next generation more involved in our efforts. Even I've been in the business 20 years now. I'm not the technology or the social media expert. Someone much younger than me now needs to tell me, how to communicate better. And we need that group to be more involved in our industry. We need more divisions, elements of our industry that speak to that topic. For some jurisdictions, community preparedness just isn't a priority. And for others, it is more of a priority. So I think there's a lot of pieces that go into it, but customizing the messaging, and really sharing some of these lessons from these incidents. We only share the lessons within our industry. We never advertise with the public. And I know the public's bandwidth, if you will, is limited, and they want things in sound bites. But there is information we can share from some of these reports that explains how the role of the public during these incidents, and maybe how they can be better prepared too. And we have to realize that that's politically challenging to say, hey, the public, you maybe need to do some things to be more prepared. It's a horrible part of our society that we're experiencing, but it's not going away. So we have to live with that reality and talk about it. And I think a big thing missing in our society is just the ability to talk about these things. Lots of different avenues to take.
Yeah, it was real eye-opening for me watching, because I'm involved with the CERT program down here, and we just did a teen CERT academy, and watching those kids put on a tourniquet, and they're hesitant and whatnot, but then you imagine, because some of us have seen what a need for tourniquet really looks like, and put them in that situation. They're just not there yet, and I'm just curious if you had a technique for at least having that conversation, because you have to be politically correct and emotionally sensitive.
Yeah, absolutely. My biggest concern now is we never thought about this 20 years ago, because you kind of assumed, at least as Americans, we would all help each other in a response. But we're such a divided country now that, frankly, people ask, well, Nick, what's your greatest fear? What keeps us up at night? And now it's what hazard we as Americans who are divided bring to the response to an emergency. If we have a cyber attack and we don't have access to power and water or finances and banking, those types of things, are we just going to turn on each other and eat each other alive? And I sadly think that that's something we now need to prepare more for.
I think so too. What I think is interesting, kind of along that lines, is like, even with a natural disaster, I would say during natural disasters, when the hurricane comes or the big fire rips through, people are always asking who's to blame. And I don't know why is this a societal thing, or is it really a humanity thing, where we're always looking to blame somebody for an event like a hurricane or a fire?
I think it's a little bit of both, but you think we're a very litigious society. I tell any one of my clients, if you're involved in an emergency, whatever it is, someone's getting sued.
Yeah.
And I think that litigious nature is just part of our society now. And frankly, I also think we're a bit of a society that doesn't want to take any personal responsibility. So it has to be someone else's fault that something happened. And so I do think that those are partially societal, that someone wants to be blamed. And that's why, particularly in our reports, we really try to avoid that approach of laying blame and saying, let's focus on just being better the next time. What's happened in the past, unfortunately, is the past. Justice should be done if needed, but we have to look at either preventing this or learning from it and responding better in the future. But I do think that's an unfortunate element, particularly, no one wants anyone to be hurt or to die or for property to be lost. So even, those of us, I haven't been a law enforcement officer, so I have sympathy for, the officers in Uvalde. I don't know how personally I would respond to that situation, but you have to approach all of these things with some understanding that you don't necessarily understand what was happening in that situation. And so, look to learn and grow. It doesn't help anyone bring back a family member,
Right.
that's for sure. But we have to start, we constantly use the term lesson learned, right? And we always kind of joke about it, right? Well, what's the lesson? We saw the lesson, but we haven't actually learned from it,
anything, right?
right? And that's the piece we have to focus on. And I hope that comes with it. But I do think it's a combination of societal issues, how we frame things and message them. There's a lot involved in this complex topic.
Lessons not learned or just lessons observed.
Yeah.
Mark, I'll let you have the last word.
Yep, I was going to say on that last discussion, as an evaluator, I always went into it with the mindset, evaluate the process, not necessarily the behavior, and try to figure out how to improve the process in these things. But no, I think it was a great conversation. And like I said, I'm a true believer in the after action review process. I think that's the most valuable process of any exercise, especially in the HC program. No, I appreciate the conversation.
Absolutely. Nick, thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I love the conversation as well and hope to do it with you guys again. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Hey, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. And realistically, the idea of writing the after action review is one of the most important steps that we could do in emergency management, I believe. And if it's a large event, bringing in that consultant, that's somebody who is a third party independent to be able to take a look at your processes and learn from those. Because as it's been said, like the lessons are not learned, they're just lessons observed. So we need to learn from them and improve from them. And this really helps us do that. So until next time, first of all, I forgot to tell everybody, happy 4th of July week. It was a great Independence Day week, I suppose. And I want to say happy birthday to Brian Colburn, one of the producers here from Stitch Radio. His birthday was on Independence Day. So not only are we celebrating the independence of our nation, we're celebrating the birth of a fine fellow and a Marine at that. Until next time, everybody stay safe and stay hydrated.